Putin, I think, has been playing it as you would expect, stringing it along, um, getting into the detail, bogging the thing down in all kinds of detail, and then having made half a concession, half an offer, then demanding a higher price for it, as we found over the proposed the energy infrastructure pause and the pause in fighting in the Black Sea, then immediately accompanied by further Russian conditions about, of course, Ukraine couldn't have European military support or intelligence. But I think he's probably overreached himself in that, because now Trump is fed up that Putin seems to be dragging his feet and the dream of a quick early deal on Ukraine is fading. So, Ukraine is more difficult than Trump perhaps thought. It's going to take longer. I think the likelihood now, or the possibility now, is that Trump will just get bored with the whole thing.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're talking to Lord Peter Ricketts. Lord Ricketts has had a stellar career. He's a former diplomat, but was also the first national security advisor. Lord Ricketts, welcome back to Frontline.
Nice to see you, Philip. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, economy. We're speaking on a Thursday morning. We've got Donald Trump going to give his understanding of what tariffs are in the United States. But putting that to one side, I wanted to touch on economies at the moment. The Russian economy, some $2.2 trillion. EU combined, about $20.3 trillion. The US, $30 trillion. And the UK, $2.5 trillion. How is Russia maintaining economic viability in its war with Ukraine at the moment? And has it reached a point, do you think, where it needs to continue the war to survive?
Well, I think it's maintained it by turning itself into a completely war economy, as, for example, Britain did in the Second World War. So, entire kind of industrial output, I think, is for military purposes. All the spending is going on the secret security state. I don't suppose there's any investment going into the civilian economy. So they are really sweating the economy hard in the short term, and therefore will be warping it out of shape for the longer term. They're also, I think, benefiting from the oil price, which is not bad, and they're selling their oil quite happily to countries like India and China, who haven't accepted the oil price restrictions the West has put on. So they are surviving in a way countries do in war by directing everything to the war, but they're storing up longer term trouble for the Russian economy.
Yeah, I think in warfare definition, this is what sort of comes into the definition of total war, when your economy is totally switched to that in the same way that Ukraine's is. Do you think the global response, and in particular EU and UK's response, at looking at or debating over whether we go to 2.5% of GDP, 3%, 5% of GDP, is appropriate? Should we be being bolder at the moment to try and deal with the real difficulties that are brewing?
Well, we should certainly be bolder than we are at the moment. That's clear. We've been dragging along the bottom of defence spending for decades, enjoying that peace dividend after the Berlin Wall came down. But the real swing state here is Germany. I mean, Germany, with the size of its economy, with the fact it has very little debt at the moment, that's probably the one country in Europe that can, and indeed are going to, borrow hundreds of billions of euros and to get their defence spending up and their armed forces in decent shape. None of the rest of us have got what they call the fiscal firepower, the room to increase our debt to that extent. But it's obviously right that Britain should be heading for 3% of GDP as soon as possible. Beyond that, I mean, in a democracy, that's going to be very difficult to get to. The Americans, great vaunted defense power, are spending 3.4%, and that's on a global armed forces that has huge responsibilities in Asia as well, has nuclear forces of all types, air, land, and sea. So if we got to 3% of GDP on defence and held it there for a decade, that would have a really positive effect on Britain's defence capability.
Do you think we actually understand the significance of Germany changing its constitution to allow it to get its debt bigger, to invest that in defence? And do you think Germany is going to have the political wherewithal when it eventually gets whatever shape this new coalition government is going to be, in a position that it can take a leadership role again in Europe? And where do you think France is going to fit in with this? Because politically, it is not in a good position at the moment, I think.
That's all quite true. No, I think it's a far-reaching change in the way Germany thinks of itself as a power in the world. I mean, for the last 80 years, it's happily accepted the terms that effectively the Western Allies dictated after the Second World War. The Basic Law makes Germany essentially a pacifist country. Now it is realizing it has to become much more of a hard power as well as a soft power nation. And yes, they are going to spend a lot more money. What will take a lot of time, though, is the culture change in Germany, because I think two generations have grown up essentially not thinking that strong armed forces, powerful military is the right way for Germany to go with the horrible echoes of the past. They've got to get over that, and they've got to adjust their thinking to being the sort of country that Britain and France has been, willing to use its armed forces in its national interest if that's necessary. So I think the military hardware will probably come before the culture change in Germany has worked its way through, and a new generation of Germans are prepared to, volunteer for the military, to accept that Germany is going to have a major place. What does all this do for the Franco-German relationship? Well, it certainly does change it, because France has always enjoyed being the sort of superior military power in that relationship, the nuclear power, and they will have to adjust to a stronger Germany. And yes, at the moment, cyclically, France is in a stage of uncertainty. Who knows what will happen in the 2027 presidential elections? Marine Le Pen may or may not be able to run. But actually, I think that the longer term for Europe is a trio between the UK, France, and Germany. And for the next 2 years, Macron, Starmer, Merz, I think would make a very interesting trio prepared to provide some real leadership on European defence.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talked about German culture and cultural change needed. I lived in Germany and worked in Germany for many years. And when Germany hosted the World Cup quite a few years ago, I remember the World Cup football commentators talking about the German cars with German flags going up and down, celebrating the German nationalism. And instead of talking about the football, they were talking about whether that was politically correct to happen and what the international community would think about it. When the message came back that from the international community that they thought this was a brilliant thing, that Germany was coming out of its past, then the whole debate changed, and I even saw that debate change in the German military. But when it comes to then coming together from a European perspective and European military support for Ukraine, um, do you think that the likes of France are going to be able to put to one side their nationalist approach to military, UK with its relationship with the United States, Germany in this new developing position? Will we be able to get this coalition of the willing based on this, as you said, UK, France, and Germany foundation and build it from there?
Well, I don't think that any of the three countries are going to abandon their national approach. It's a nationalist, but certainly national approach to the military. In other words, I think ideas of a European army where the European nations all pool their military capabilities into one overall command, I don't believe that. And I know from your military background, you will see the problems with that as well. I mean, the genius of NATO was that we all kept the sovereignty over our military forces, but we combined them and we put them under an American supreme commander while keeping sovereign national decisions about how they would be used. And that's how a coalition of the willing would have to work as well. The French are not about to abandon control of their armed forces to anybody else, nor are the British. So I think we're looking at a coalition generally. There's still, I think, a big question about what it might do in Ukraine. Perhaps we can come back to that. But the idea that there is going to be effectively a stronger European pillar of NATO, because the coalition that has been meeting with Starmer and then with Macron over the last month or so has included Norway, not in the EU, of course, included Turkey, NATO nations not in the EU like the UK. So it's a European pillar of NATO taking shape. I think that's a very positive thing. It's right that the Europeans should be taking back more of their control of their own destiny in terms of security and defence. There's still an awful lot to work out as to how it's going to work and who will be part of it, how it will relate to the EU, which has its own military institutions. But then there's the issue of how it might be used in Ukraine, which I think is still very, very uncertain.
Well, I think we should touch on how it's going to be used in Ukraine, because I think there's been a lot of speculation, and I think it's come out of the press leading it, about there being a peacekeeping or peace enforcing force. I think if people talk to those with a military background, most would raise at least one, if not both eyebrows at that as an idea because of the military capability it would need. What are your views on how you think any force, reassurance force, or whatever would look?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. I think that talk early on of a peacekeeping force essentially misunderstood how military forces might be used in Ukraine. To me, it implied a force that would deploy between the two potentially hostile states to oversee a ceasefire. That's a very dangerous position to find yourself in because you could find yourself fighting one side or the other. And I don't think Britain and France are at all ready to fight the Russians in any sense. Problem with the reassurance force, it sounds more reassuring, of course. Again, the mission is very unclear. If it's to reassure the Ukrainians that the Russians will be deterred from attacking again, then you're back to the same problem. What happens if it goes wrong? Are you prepared to stand and fight the Russians, or would the force have to withdraw? So I think until Starmer and Macron can be much clearer about what it would actually do, we have to be very cautious about it. I think I've noticed in the last week or two Keir Starmer talking much less about a reassurance force. He's been talking about an overall set of initiatives that would help to support Ukraine, further sanctions on Russia, economic and military support, military arms to Ukraine, perhaps training support, that kind of thing. And then Macron is talking about a force which would be present at key infrastructure points in Ukraine, airports, ports, that sort of thing. I mean, that at least is not a formed fighting force that might find itself having to fight the Russians. But again, ministers would need to be clear what happens if things go wrong, if the force is attacked, if the Russians, manage to have some sort of missile land on it and then they will claim by accident, what happens then? So lots and lots of questions to be asked. I think the spirit is right that the Europeans should be doing everything they can to support Ukraine. It's the only way to ever get this war to an end is to show that Ukraine is strong and, if possible, getting stronger. But I think, in my experience, you've been in similar positions, Philip. I've been in the room when ministers have been deciding about the use of armed forces in Iraq, for example, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and it's quite easy to take a decision to get a force into somewhere, to get something done. It's then much more difficult to get it out again, or to sustain it, keep public opinion behind you when things start to go wrong. So let's ask the hard questions now, not in a negative or destructive spirit, but because it's right that we get this thing properly thought through at this point. By the way, I think the British Parliament will want to ask these very hard questions as well, and the issue I think would have to come to the British Parliament. So we might as well get them on the carpet now.
You heard it here first. The inside track that I'm picking up on is, if we remember, a couple of months ago, there was this discussion about taking the training packages that the UK is putting together from an international coalition in the UK for Ukrainian military, and taking that and putting it inside Ukraine, backed with other coalition forces. That's what I'm hearing this reassurance force would be, to help build that capability up. But you're right, it throws up so many more questions about force protection. And we don't have a peace agreement, or even the outline of a peace agreement, on the table at the moment. And if we look at from the White House in the last 10 days or so, we've had initially Zelensky going to the Oval Office to sign a mineral deal. Then we had the infamous spat with JD Vance that Donald Trump came in and enhanced. And then we had the Americans come out and say they wanted control of Ukrainian power stations, and in particular Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. And Putin has come out and said, no, you're not having that. We're keeping that. And then there seems to be a different mineral deal on the table that seems to have been refused. And it's reported that Zelensky has refused that. What do you think is going on? And do you think Donald Trump really cares about Ukraine, or is he more interested in his relationship with Russia?
I'm afraid I don't think that Donald Trump cares the slightest for Ukraine. I think what he cares about is getting a deal and showing he's got a deal. He's a man who likes to have deals, and he wants them quickly. And if you're a negotiator and you're in a tearing hurry, that always puts you at a major disadvantage. And I'm afraid he's fallen into that trap. And I think early on he made, I think, a disastrous decision that Russia was strong and Ukraine was weak. So Russia had to be appeased and offered all kinds of concessions, like Ukraine would never join NATO, like they would have to surrender their eastern provinces to Russia for good, and Ukraine had to be strong-armed to the table. And that, I think, was what all that awful meeting in the Oval Office was about. And the Europeans should be told to kind of shut up and wait to pick up the pieces when it was their turn. That has completely failed. The idea of getting a quick deal on a 30-day ceasefire has come apart. And Putin, I think, has been playing it as you would expect, stringing it along, um, getting into the detail, bogging the thing down in all kinds of detail, and then having made half a concession, half an offer, then demanding a higher price for it, as we found over the proposed the energy infrastructure pause and the pause in fighting in the Black Sea, then immediately accompanied by further Russian conditions about, of course, Ukraine couldn't have European military support or intelligence. But I think he's probably overreached himself in that, because now Trump is fed up that Putin seems to be dragging his feet and the dream of a quick early deal on Ukraine is fading. So, Ukraine is more difficult than Trump perhaps thought. It's going to take longer. I think the likelihood now, or the possibility now, is that Trump will just get bored of the whole thing. He's moved on to tariffs. He's got a new negotiation, new headline going on, and perhaps rather like with Gaza, where the proposal to buy Gaza lasted about a week, and then he lost interest in that. He may find that if he can't get a quick deal in Ukraine, well, it's all too difficult, and he'll just leave it to the Europeans to pick up the pieces while cutting American losses there, as it were. That's not at all a good outcome for Ukraine. I mean, therefore, I think there's a quite considerable risk that this war will continue and that Trump's flurry of peacemaking efforts will give way to the stalemate returning, probably with a lower level of American support for Ukraine. It's absolutely not what I want to see, but I think that's quite a likely outcome for this year.
But if we look at what Donald Trump's taken on in his first 100 days, he's promised peace in Ukraine. He's got a deteriorating situation in the Middle East. His focus is clearly on China, and I might touch on that a little bit more in a second. And looking at that, but he's also got this Doge campaign ripping apart the U.S. political infrastructure to create huge savings and all the rest of it. And then he's got an economic war that he's starting with some of his closest friends around the world, never mind those that he sees as hostile states. Any one of those activities for a competent, capable, experienced government would take the whole of a presidential term or a parliamentary term to deal with. He's doing it all at once. Does he have the horsepower to deal with it?
And we're not even at 100 days yet, Philip, just to remember that.
Exactly.
He's also had a go at the Houthis, and
Yep.
he's threatened Iran. And so, I mean, this is what they call flooding the zone. No, he doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with all this. He's got a very inexperienced national security staff, as we saw from those dreadful signal leaks the other day. Totally unprofessional and incompetent. And so I think the technique is to shake things up and to destabilize, and then to see how the cards fall and where there might be advantage for America. Hence this practice, which I think you can see developing as a pattern of having a go, shaking the tree hard. If nothing much moves, well, then just leaving it and moving on. Gaza, he's now basically abandoned to the Israelis to do whatever they want there. Ukraine, he could well back out, I think, if nothing much happens in the next few weeks, which in some ways would help Putin. I mean, Putin would be okay with that because he's gradually advancing in a grinding way in Ukraine. So, these are a lot of sort of half-finished initiatives taken and then not followed through, because in international affairs, as you know, it's the following through. It's the long, hard, thankless task of trying to turn an initial idea into some sort of lasting solution to problems which are deep, deep rooted, which in terms of Gaza or Ukraine or Iran, incredible hostility between the sides, a great deal of national effort gone in on all sides. These are not going to be problems that are solved, by a presidential wave of the hand or a threat of tariffs. So he is finding the world is more complicated and more difficult, more recalcitrant than perhaps he was thinking when he came in thinking that he was the master of the world. He's not, and therefore perhaps this national security team will begin to learn. But at the moment, I think all of what we've said just strengthens the need for the Europeans to be getting much more serious about taking the lead in our own continent for our own security and defence. I mean, in a way, the idea of the West that we've had for the last 80 years is basically over now. The Americans will treat the Europeans, including the Brits, transactionally as every other country. There's no kind of sentimentality, there's no sense of allies have a special call on America. It's America only, not just America first. And then in that world, we've all got to work much more closely together. And I personally have been very pleased to see Starmer, out front on this issue of Europe's security with Emmanuel Macron. Starmer has the political longevity. Macron has the experience in office. Together, they're quite a powerful combination. If you add Merz to that, then I think we are really getting some sort of shape for dealing with European security affairs in the future.
I was talking to Kurt Volker, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, yesterday, and he was saying that Donald Trump's um, rationale for keeping the pressure on Europe in every way possible is if he takes his foot off the gas, then Europe will suddenly go huge sigh of relief and go back to not investing in defense and just situation normal and try and deal with everything. Why do you think Europe didn't wake up to the fact that 5 years ago we saw exactly what Donald Trump was going to be like when he was in his first presidency? There was all the indications that he was going to get in again. Europe sat there watching almost with its jaw wide open in shock, hoping that Trump wouldn't get in and they wouldn't have to deal with it. And then when he came in, we're being very reactive. Why was Europe not more proactive in preparing for what was happening? Because we wouldn't be in the same economic situation today if we did.
That is true. I think we were all suffering from optimism bias. We thought that this Trump thing was a one-off and couldn't happen again. There was also the point that Trump one was pretty incompetent. Trump, that he fumbled around. His team weren't really aligned with what he wanted to do. They were always softening the edge of what he tried to do. And I think there was a feeling by the end that we'd survived that. Europe had come through. The worst of what Trump had been threatening hadn't happened. He hadn't left NATO. Tariffs on Europe had been, relatively few. And so there was a sigh of relief, as you say, rather than a kind of recognition that, this was a generational change happening in America. And in a way, Biden was the aberration because Biden, had grown up in the Cold War. He had the transatlantic relationship in his bloodstream in a way no future president ever will have. And therefore, at the end of Biden, it defaulted back to Trump. But no future American president is going to have the same kind of approach to Europe that, presidents like Eisenhower and Kennedy had in their time. So, yes, we've been too slow to wake up. I don't think that if Trump lifted his foot off the gas now, things would go back to where they were. I think there's been a profound shock to Europe. I think that Vance visit to Munich and the things he said there about Europe went pretty deeply into people's souls. And therefore, we are now finally in what the Germans call a Zeitenwende, a change of era. I don't think things will go back. It is too late. But, democratic politicians usually leave it too late before reacting. And it's much easier to muddle through and hope that things will get better than to kind of bite the bullet, mixing my metaphors, and put up defence spending. Very difficult that is in a democracy. So we have been too slow. But when democracies finally get round to it, they tend to have public opinion with them. So it can then turn out to be quite a long-term trend rather than just shifting from one stimulus to another.
Well, interesting. You mentioned JD Vance at Munich. We also JD Vance in Greenland, and re-emphasizing Donald Trump saying, we have to take it. But the Defense of Greenland Agreement between the U.S. and Kingdom Denmark, signed on the 27th of April, 1951, effectively allows the U.S. to have as many bases as they want in Greenland, and Greenland has got no real say in it. They can put a few officers in the bases, but they've got Greenland militarily. How do you think Vladimir Putin is seeing this and Xi Jinping is seeing this from a long-term perspective, considering they're not thinking in 100 days or a presidential term, they're thinking in generations as they approach things. Who's going to win this thinking game and geopolitical maneuvering game?
Well, the Chinese are pretty good at thinking long term. And so, yes, they will certainly be thinking in generational terms. Putin, I think, is in a pretty desperate position, trying to cling on to power, having made a major gamble in Ukraine. And although he hasn't lost the war, strategically, he's lost a great deal already. He's had a strengthening effect on NATO, enlarging of NATO that would never have happened without this. But Trump, in his rush to kind of break things and see what happens, isn't putting the pieces together clearly because, yes, he wants a geopolitical alliance with Russia. That's clear. He sees big goodies for the Americans in terms of relationships with Russia, including in oil and gas. But in Greenland, if America increases its role there, that is competitive with Russia. The Russians have also got their eyes on the high north and the Arctic and will not be very keen to see a strengthened American presence in the Arctic Circle, even if they don't actually take over Greenland, which I don't believe they will. And the big winner from what's been going on between the Europeans and Trump in the last few months has been China. I mean, Xi Jinping must be, popping Chinese champagne corks all over Beijing at the moment. America sees China as their longer term generational competition, and yet they've given China a major boost by this huge quarrel with the Europeans, which will push Europeans towards China for trade, for financial relations, and so on. And he is not going to break the Russia China axis because Russia is terribly dependent on China now. So, in a way, Trump is forcing a geopolitical realignment, which is not in the long term interests of America. But that's the last thing he has in mind.
As we come to the end here, I have to ask you this: are we formally in a Cold War II situation, and how close do you think this could be to getting into a hot war, either in Europe or globally?
Well, I don't think it's going to get into a hot war. I mean, we started by talking about the underlying weakness of the Russian economy. Russia has suffered a great deal in the last 3 years in Ukraine, and it hasn't beaten Ukraine, which is a much smaller country with much smaller armed forces. So the idea they will take on NATO in a military confrontation, I think, is really unlikely. And that's the last thing the Chinese want either. They want to dominate in Asia. They certainly don't want a world war. Is it a Cold War? I mean, I'm slightly wary of analogies like that. The Cold War was different, but it is certainly a more transactional world, a world which is back to spheres of influence, with strong men, China, Russia, America, each trying to have their own sphere of influence. And Europe rather stuck in the middle of all that, still trying to cling to a sense of values, of the rule of law, of the democratic way of doing things, under pressure from all sides. So yeah, it's a much more difficult, much more transactional world where alliances can less be depended on than they were in the past. And that's the world that Britain has chosen to leave the EU and forge out into as an independent country. It seems to me there's a very, very strong case for at least getting as close as possible to the EU on all our defence and security issues, because they are in the end the group that share our values and interests most closely.
Well, I'll take your view, we're not going to a hot war, as a good positive note to end on. Lord Peter Ricketts, it's been a real pleasure talking to you this morning.
Thank you very much, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you would like to be the first to get exclusive content, please sign up for Times Radio membership by clicking the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for regular updates and read about updates at thetimes.com. Thank you for watching today.